Hello there guys, it's Joey fighting with the lighting. The lighting is all over the place right now because we're due to get a thunderstorm, and so the light is going crazy bright and then dark, and it won't pick one, so I apologise for that up front. So this is a video about Temple of the Storytellers, and it's discussing the archetype of the storyteller, the importance of storytelling within spirituality. It's also going to be for a requested spell set, which will be at the end, and we'll show the pieces at the end. So if you're more interested in just talking and the discussion element, we'll have that first, and then the items will be at the very end, because the lady requested that we do this video, and I thought it was a really nice topic to do anyway. And I was thinking about this in terms of modern storytelling and how modern storytelling impacts us in all kinds of ways, but specifically for spirituality here in this video. So without giving any spoilers away, so I won't, and I was thinking about this when I was watching Game of Thrones, which I managed to get a free trial so I could watch the new series because I was going a little bit cray not being able to watch it. And I was just thinking about the impact that really good storytelling has, and the way that it brings people together and gives people something to discuss and think about, and how stories really make us human. I've always believed this, and I pulled some quotes from some of my favourite authors, and I will be touching on the idea of oracular storytelling and like folklore storytelling versus modern storytelling, but we're starting off in a more modern context just because I think it's an easier point of relative connection that we can, you know, discuss. So Tolkien from Lord of the Rings, it's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo, the ones that really mattered. Sometimes you didn't want to know the end because how could the end be happy? But in the end it's only a passing thing, this shadow. Those were the stories that stayed with you. Folks in those stories had lots of chances of turning back, only they didn't. They kept going because they were holding on to something, that there is some good in this world and it's worth fighting for. That's paraphrased from Tolkien. It's missing out a couple of lines here and there just because it's a very long quote. Tolkien is perhaps an obvious choice, but there's just a crow just landed on the window outside. Given the modern incantation through the movies, which are a good 10 years old now, which is scary. Oh, if I go back here, the light's not so bad. This wiggle. And I've always loved Tolkien, as long as I can remember. I remember my grandmother talking about The Hobbit, and it being a very dominant presence in the storytelling of my childhood, that Tolkien was around. And I remember going on holiday, and it was actually 2011, because obviously 2011 sticks in your mind because of the World Trading Center and everything. And I actually took Tolkien's books on holiday to Corfu, which is where I was when the tragedy occurred. And I remember, and they were the big thick ones as well. I remember taking these big thick books for reading because it was such a long way to travel to Corfu, and getting some funny looks from the people who were like on the airports, because I was youngish at that point, and they were just like, okay then. And that was me, always head in a book, always. Another one of my favourite authors is Philip Pullman, who wrote his Dark Materials, which is The Golden Compass is the first one, and the film, I think they only did the first one, was disastrous. There has been talk of them doing a BBC TV series on and off, so whether they will breathe life into it. I kind of hope they do, and do a better job, because his Dark Materials as books are amazing. There's a darkness to it, like, you know, like it suggests. He uses the idea of daemons, like they're basically a spirit. It's a bit like a Patronus, but they're more active than that. They take on different animal forms depending on the soul of the individual, and as children they can change and shift, and then once they become set around a certain age, they take on a definite animal form. And there's a lot of, in his work he talks a lot about things which are basically about morality and questionable ethics and souls and what makes an individual person. And he has the following quote: "Stories are the most important thing in the world. Without stories, we wouldn't be human at all." And I completely and utterly agree with him. And then finally is Terry Pratchett, who is, sorely missed in the world. "People think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, it is the other way around." And that is so true. It's interesting, the idea of storytelling. So I'm going to take that quote by Pratchett, I'm going to run with it a little bit. People think that stories are shaped by people. In fact, they're the other way around. So people are shaped by the stories that they grow up with, the stories they come into contact with. I personally consider myself to be a storyteller. I've been writing stories and books as long as I can remember, and really I should hop on it and get them published. I mean, I love fantasy above all else, although I do read a lot of different stories because I think that's interesting. And really, people's lives are their stories, and I always find that fascinating. And I think that's something that's sorely missed in the world now, is the appreciation for the different stories of different walks of life for different people. I think if we listen to each other's stories a little bit better, if we sought to hear the adventure and the passion and the love and the loss and the sadness for all of those things that really truly occur to people, we do a lot better in terms of humanity. We all bond over stories like Game of Thrones. We're all horrified by things like Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones is a really good example, and his books are stellar because they are brutal. They're based on kind of like a medieval feeling with obviously with a huge dose of fantasy, but they are based on a medieval political machinations, then with the fantasy around it, that are quite true to life in some areas. The backstabbing and the courts and the kings and the queens and war, and these. We get so invested in things like Game of Thrones, and we get so horrified at the loss of our favourite people in those things. And you think, if we applied that to real life and realise that people are just the same as these characters that we're in love with in terms of stories, the world would do so much better. It would. In terms of spirituality, storytelling for me has many, many facets. There are the idea of oracular traditions, such as the Celtic tradition, which I particularly follow, although there are others, of course. And the documentation of a lot of this oracular mythology and folklore, which is heavily influencing in a lot of pagan practice, for better or worse, is oracular and has been recorded from people outside, so Christian monks, for the most part. And then, of course, stories have been lost, things have not been written down, things have been changed and altered, and the slant has been put on things. Such is the nature of history and the recording of pretty much everything. But stories in particular can shapeshift over time. And they can shapeshift over time for a number of reasons. One, the audience, who is being shaped by the stories. People telling the stories will put their own personal slant on things, their own experiences on things. So the ancient Celts would have brought in, their tribal warfare a lot more into their stories, and kind of like the glorification of that and the reasons for that would then, reflect in the mythos of their gods and goddesses. Today, and I talk about this in terms of modern evolutionary, the modern evolution of gods, and I strongly believe in evolutionary gods and goddesses, because I think, to say that our stories are exactly the same as the stories of our ancestors isn't factual. We are still at root human beings, and the main themes still apply. We're still interested in love, adventure, intrigue, and then there are darker themes of betrayal and the criminal elements, aggressive elements, death. Death isn't aggressive, but the deaths and the mourning process and things that leave a mark on people become part of the narrative, become part of the story of us, and we become shaped by the stories that we live. And we are living stories. We are living stories, and we are living storytellers. The stories that we present of ourselves, of our lives, are often not exactly what occurred. We see things through rose tinted glasses, we forget things. And if you haven't seen the Tim Burton movie Big Fish, I highly, highly recommend it, because it's basically a fantastical story based by a man who's on his deathbed telling his son about it. And his son gets to the end of it and dismisses it all as fantasy, it's pure fantasy, and then finds out that, you know, certain elements of it were not pure fantasy, certain elements of it were true, and it was just the way that the story was told made it bigger than life. And then there's this whole thread throughout that about what storytelling is and how the messages get across, and how we see things through rose tinted glasses sometimes, or expand on things. Some people flat out lie, and but the thing is, then they become part of the narrative. And so stories are more accurate to the description of human experience than, say, truth or fact, because we don't know the truth or fact of a situation, particularly in history or in general. You know, things are hidden. The accepted narrative of the world is just that. It's accepted because that's based on the information that most of us have available to us, or a belief, a cultural belief, a social belief about the way the world is. And that's very much about the stories and narratives shaping us as individuals. The modern way in which storytelling influences us in terms of spiritual path walking is a little bit different to how, unfortunately, how it used to be. And I think we have lost something in terms of spiritual storytelling. When you used to have all the tribe around a fire, for example, we're rose tinted glassing, like I said, but still. And the ants and the wise ones, the elders, would pass down stories, and those stories would have the myth, but also the fables would be very much about morality. They would be very much about passing down the lessons, shaping the minds of young people about things that would matter to them, the consequences of certain actions, wisdom, such as it was, morality, and however that changes. And I think maybe there's something a little bit lost in that people don't sit around and listen to stories so much anymore. Stories, again, have changed dramatically. We still have books, thank goodness, but I mean, with the onset of technology, something else becomes a little bit lost about that as well. I feel like I am a big book fanatic. I prefer physical books to, say, on the iPad, on the Kindle or whatever, and sometimes I will get them on the Kindle just because of the price difference, but every single time I'll be like, I'm betraying books, just because books are so much more tactile and the stories feel more alive that way. The smell of a book, the feel of a book, there's something about the experiencing of storytelling in that way that is much more than on a screen. And when I was studying at university and things, I would have much more trouble trying to study off a screen than I would from a book. Something about the way that human beings interact with words in like the very ancient art of bookbinding, going right back to like ancient Egypt and papyrus and things. There's something very ancient, and it's almost like skin memory, like muscle memory, and the way that that's been passed down through generations, and how books are still here, even though you know, technology seeks to eradicate it largely. So the power of the written word as well as the spoken word is very well documented and very well realized. I think that the stories that we read and pass down change us and influence us and our children and their children. The written word can really truly change us in terms of all forms of story. Sometimes stories are more of the scientific method, you know, the narrative of understanding through human experience. That is the power of the written word to document and change minds, to open minds to new ideas. And storytelling is a really powerful thing. you think about it in terms of spirituality, we can sit and we can discuss the stories, the narratives of how we practice spirituality. Even vlogging to an extent, even making videos to an extent, is kind of the kind of the placing of this is my story at somebody else's screen. I mean, it's not, you know, placing it in their hands as you might do a book, but it is placing it into their life. You know, this is my story. This is how I practice. This is how I believe. This is how I've come to feel about the world. These are some of the common threads that you and I have, or perhaps differences in opinion, and that can be a really interesting analysis, a really interesting discussion. I love that sort of thing. I love listening to how different people approach spirituality, even if that's not necessarily how I approach it. And some people approach it in some madly beautiful different ways. Molly is one, Molly from Her Speak, and she has this beautiful pop art aesthetic, and brings that to every creative layer that she does in her narrative, in her story of her spirituality, and that's gorgeous. It's not something that I can do because I'm about as artistic as I'm as painty and drawy artistic as a brick. I can do my art in other forms, I guess, but not in that particular, not well anyway. Stick men, that's about it. But I really feel like storytelling is this wonderful breakthrough that stops stagnation. I think telling stories is really about stopping human beings from becoming lifeless. There is something about the telling of a really good story that brings the emotions up to the surface, whatever those emotions might be. Storytelling can really impact us on an emotional as well as an intellectual level. They can change our lives. Sometimes, how many of us have a story or more than one story, and when we read it, it was so powerful that it changed us in some way? And it's difficult to really explain that kind of moment of soul that we have with storytelling. And we might then go on and say, you need to read this, you need to see this, you need to watch this, you need to hear this. This is incredible. And sometimes it's very much in a real life setting rather than a completely, I don't think any story is completely, you know, fantasy, but because there's elements of the author in everything. There's always truth in everything. And there's wisdom to be gleaned from all stories. But if you're thinking of things in terms of a real world narrative, then the stories can also impact our humanity. So hearing some of the horrors that have occurred at the hands of something can bring out the best in people and the worst in people, judging on how they react to the story. And it ultimately is a mirror. Storytelling is a mirror for who we truly are. And we can look at who we are in that mirror and we can become better, or not. And that's kind of the choice that follows from storytelling. So the set for the lady is around this process, the process of ancestors. Storytelling connects us to our ancestors through our oral tradition and our history, as well as the written storytelling as well, of course, to some degree. Family trees are a really wonderful example of what I would consider a story that can then grow from one very particular, historical graph, really. The idea of the Temple of the Storytellers is the power of the written word as well as the oral tradition. It's the intellect. It is the family, particularly like Chris describes as grandmothers around the fire, and all telling the stories of our ancestors to us through a spiritual connection. We connect to our ancestors through the stories of their lives, the parts that we are told, the parts that we remember, and the parts that we are told by others when we don't remember them, or that are documented in some way, say diaries and or film or so on and so forth. The idea behind the set in particular is the idea of storytelling as being a microcosm and a macrocosm for void and creation, space and cosmos, the human brain. So the Big Bang, the explosion within the cosmos, the creation of life, is akin to the human thought process, neurons firing in the mind, in the brain. Therefore, the human mind is then a reflection of creation within the universe. It's basically a universal mind, so as without, so within. And I felt very, 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 very strongly that huge creative process that happens in the universe, that huge bang, is very much akin to the human neurons firing in the brain, the sudden thought, the sudden idea. And I really liked that process and that thought of how that's how stories come into being. There is something scientific but something soulful in the same moment, because we cannot fully explain human consciousness. So I liked that kind of meshing. Anyway, I'm going to show you the items and then finish up this video. So the first and foremost, we have the pillar, which is a beautiful black, and then we have the, oh gosh, the lighting is all kinds of crazy, but it's basically lots of purples with different speckles of different colours, and it is very much akin to the void there in the pillar. Then we have the oil, the anointing oil, which smells gorgeous. It's all about breaking through stagnation, finding creativity, finding creation, getting those neurons firing, getting that creative process booming. Then we have this smudge. There we go. Very much about the cosmos again. Oh, this is so good. You know what? I'm going to make myself one of these. Yeah, I am. It's so good. I really, truly freaking love this smudge. So creating the temple of the storytellers within the smudge is very much about building an energetic temple, which is what I talk about the smudges being on purpose. The smudges are much stronger than anything else in terms of scent. They're layered scent upon scent upon scent. That's how they're made. And it's essential oils and then resins and then herbs and flowers or whatever it might be, all designed around scent. So you'll never see any flowers in my smudges that don't smell good burning. Rose petals en masse do not smell good burning, so it's a real mistake to put rose petals in, for example. So everything is about scent and creating that energetic temple, that energetic space of creation. So the energetic temple for the storytellers is very much like a Greek temple by night, staring out at the night sky, analysing the stars. Maybe it's a little bit of a peek into the universe, about seeing cosmos and universes and galaxies and stars and things that really truly inspire the storytelling. And I love the idea of looking up to the stars and telling the stories of your people by firelight. I love that analogy. And last but not least is the spell orb. We have a beautiful purple shimmy ribbon, as we do. The purple shimmy ribbon is very much about being in the realm of spirit and bringing the stories down through the crown chakra, down into the mind, and bringing the thought processes and boop, 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 boop. The little charm is a little cup of tea with a little spoon, because everybody needs a cup of tea or something similar, make a coffee or whatever, when you are writing and being creative or telling stories. It's a very common theme. There's some beautiful flowers and things going in here, and hopefully, yes, you can. Right, and the very key point about this particular, apart from all the stars for the cosmos, is there are multiple scrolls. This is the first time I have ever done this. So there are multiple scrolls with different coloured threads tying each one, because each different coloured thread represents a different part of the web of life, the web of weird, if you like, following the Nordic tradition, or the web of the universe, the cosmos, the great ecosystem, denoting different elements of that thought and process. There are many, many different scrolls in here because I have written a story across the different scrolls. And each scroll represents a little piece of a story which is in the mind, which is as yet untold, as yet unknown. The story exists within the mind, in pieces sometimes, but it will be told. And I really like that idea. So that is Temple of the Storytellers. I hope you guys enjoyed this little peek into this little discussion into storytelling and what storytelling means to me, as well as the spell items for the lady in question. I'm sorry this video is slightly late. I've had technology issues, and it's actually working out a lot better in Mercury in retrograde, which is bizarre. Maybe it's taking pity on me because I'm a Virgo. Who knows? I don't know, but there you go. That's the video for this. I will get those available for you ASAP. Many blessings.